For just the university, these two topics account for like 8 semester credits, and so I'm going to put it all into 1 hour. Give you some highlights and try and tie a few things together. That's what the UNs look like in some of the areas I was working in. The gist of it, though, forest ecology. We'll actually get down into some basic physics here even. But trees respond to their environment just like we do. And through the talk, I'm going to kind of contrast the environment of the kind of greater landscape versus the environment of the tree or the stand. And that first one is fixed, and I say sort of because I have a little side story on that. And one can change over a relatively short period of time. It could be either natural change for a variety of sources, or we could do the changing ourselves. And that's where the silviculture comes in. So one way to define silviculture is just applied forest ecology. So we're taking these things that we know about, and the way things react to their environment, and we're manipulating things to our needs. When you talk about silviculture, you really talk about 2 kinds of operations you could do. One that's meant to regenerate, and one that's not meant to regenerate. You just boil it down to those 2 categories. So we, again, accomplish these objectives by just manipulating different aspects of the environment to accomplish what we want, whether it is regeneration or better growth or whatever. There's intended consequences, sometimes there's unintended consequences, sometimes there's unavoidable things that we might want to mitigate. But really what we're doing is just kind of working what we have in terms of the environment of the stand and the environment of the stand within the landscape. Of course, Utah is kind of a neat place to do this because these kind of fundamentals I want to talk about are really evident. We have, as opposed to back east, say, we have a lower tree line and an upper tree line, and then we have all this sort of aspect control, depending on what your slope and aspect is like. You may or may not have even forests there. Then we kind of get up in the middle elevation. We're kind of in a nice continuous band of forest until we get up to the upper tree line, and then there's kind of a different group of variables acting on that to limit that. And so we'll talk about all these things kind of in their kind of elemental form through the talk. Now, the unit I work for now does forest inventory. We do it all across the United States on all land ownerships. And those patterns that you can kind of generally see standing out on the landscape, when we actually get out there and count trees and classify them, you can see that those patterns start to show themselves. This is in the UNs. And you can kind of see these general bands coming up, from the low elevation to high elevation. And we can take what we see on that, whether it's aspen or Doug fir or whatever, and then relate that back to the conditions on the ground and put that into other models, topographic models, climate models, whatever it is, and kind of fill in the spaces in between the plots. And again, the UN is kind of one of the best places anywhere to look at this because it's got this nice kind of racetrack effect of all different forest types, fringing the end, going from sagebrush or desert up into the subalpine forest and then eventually into rock and ice. Everything we could do is kind of take that same information and put it into more kind of conceptual models. What I did for a paper I did last year was just to kind of take some transects through the UNs because nobody had really described it as to how the different zones broke out there. And then that little diagram on the right there, on the bottom you have kind of what I was talking about with topography, slope and aspect and that. That really controls moisture. Water is a big deal for us out here. And then elevation, which is also related to moisture, comes into play there. But you can see that some of these types that are like the Engelmann spruce, subalpine fir up at the top here, depending on if it's a sheltered area down in the river bottom or something like that, could actually occur a lot lower elevation than you would expect it normally on flat ground. And like I said, the site factors and all these little fundamentals are what controls that. You can actually open up the scope a little bit more. And I did this for actually a bunch of geographers and geologists. And I wanted to come up with some kind of contrast, and I was concentrating on the UNs, but I thought, well, how do the UNs relate to the other mountain ranges around here? So I took the Bighorns up in northern Wyoming and just looked at kind of similar sized chunks of land all the way down into southern Utah, and you can see that there's most of the same forest types occur, but they occur in different places at different elevations in here. So we actually have 2 different effects going on here. One is in general, that as you go from like pinion juniper woodland up to Engelmann spruce, it's kind of what you see standing on the, looking out the window right here. change in elevation. But then if you're looking on a bigger landscape over the scale of a couple of decent-sized states, then you see that each individual type, as you go farther in latitude, changes where it is. So when you're looking at Doug fir, let's say down in southern or in up in the Bighorns, you're down a little over 6,000 feet, 6,500 feet. If you're down in southern Utah, you're going to be more around 8,000. This is kind of Ecology 101. It kind of explains why we have tundra at 12,000 feet up here in the Rockies, and it's at sea level up in coastal Alaska. Now, it's interesting is you see a lot of pictures like this in the scientific literature. Is everybody talks about climate change and what's going on, and talking about fire, buildup of fuel in the woods and that. And this is a geographer from back east. He did his dissertation out here in the Uintas. And he located a lot of these old photographs from the late 1800s and rephotographed them. And what you can see is, there's, look at this area right here, you see there's a lot more vegetation there than there used to be. Like I said, almost anywhere, you look in the Black Hills, you look almost anywhere, you're going to see this general trend over the last 100 or so years of adding more wood on there. And they say, well, that's climate change, it's warming up, but, we did it and all that stuff. But if you look carefully at the right-hand side, in the upper picture, you say, okay, well, from 1870 to 2001, obviously the trees have grown a lot better. I mean, you see a lot of rock up there. But there's also evidence in that picture that sometimes before 1870, it was warmer than it is in 1870. You can pick that out. The dead trees. All these little Krumholtz things. Now, these are trees that the climate is so rough up there at that time when that was photographed that they can't survive above the snowpack. But apparently, at some time in the past, what happened is the leaves on these things took off and probably grew for 80 to 100 years as an upright tree, just like they're doing now. So rather than kind of a linear thing, these things have gone evidently through a cycle. And this, the cycles have happened over and over again. This guy, Jeff Monroe, actually found some trees, snags, no live trees around at all, stranded about 300 or 400 feet higher in elevation than what the tree line is now because of the old growth that was there before.
And did he do all this work in the Uintas, or did he cover other parts of the
He's pretty big on the Uintas. He hasn't done much elsewhere. He does done a lot of soil work, a lot of detailed stuff. So we're kind of going for the big scale back down, and we're going to start kind of over at the tree scale.
John, can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Work that Jeff was doing in the back earlier was. It looks like in the 1870s there was way fewer trees. In addition to the drier cold, was the fire and other effects of that going on?
Well, in the lower elevations, we think about ponderosa pine forest, which is a classic thing that people have studied to death, with fire, ponderosa Doug fir, things like that. Up there, there's so much rock and bare ground that fire, I don't think was that much of a factor up there. I mean, the growing season up there is terribly short. So to get a fire going was interesting, and even in that and I'm not sure why, but you see in the 1870 picture, there's a lot more snow up in the mountains and up in here, but than there is here. But I think partially because of the vegetation and maybe some other things going on, some other seasonal stuff, some of these little pockets, why are they here when there's less snow up in the mountains? So there's other stuff going on there.
the same time of year?
It's hard to say, but you would think that if there's that much more snow up there, that it would have gone, would have gone out of here. If it melted out of here, it would have melted out of there first. But I think the vegetation is actually trapping some and that sort of thing. I actually come back to that a little bit later on. So we're going to talk about these fundamentals again: air, water, light, heat, soil, and then competition. It's kind of as you go farther down the list, especially with soil competition, you're really integrating a few more things. And so first I'm going to talk about just kind of generalities of what we call gradients and boundary layers. You put your hand on the stove, you can hold it up here, it's not too bad. Get down there close, it gets hotter. You get to touch it, of course you get burned. Add a little wind to that, a little air in the equation, essentially, it pushes that gradient down towards the stove. I mean, that's our, take it the opposite effect, that's our wind chill if we step out here and it's kind of breezy. This stuff goes on in the woods. Likewise, if we have very dry air and you have some sort of moist condition, a pond or my kitchen sponge there, what's going to happen is there's going to be a tremendous pressure for that water to go into the atmosphere, and that's Utah. I love the way things evaporate out here. but if you have a lot of humidity in the air, let's say, that gradient, that pressure is much lower. Now, I lived in South Florida for a bunch of years, and I actually, when I take my kitchen sponge out and I throw it on the counter in Logan, it's like to a crisp, the next, by that afternoon. In Miami, I would do that, and one time I dropped a seed of an orange on there and came back the next day and it germinated. It was still moist. So again, depending on what the environment's like, it's going to change the behavior of air and water in that. Air, of course, everybody knows that trees produce a lot of oxygen. We don't realize that they actually need oxygen too, especially in this time of year before they've really leafed out. The roots are respiring and that, so they need oxygen in soil. Air is a good insulator. It doesn't conduct heat very well. Transports water and heat, like I just showed you. That can also be a physical disturbance. We in silviculture really worry about wind quite a bit. The position of our operations, and the structure of the stand. One of the things I'll come back to towards the end when we talk about the silviculture is structure of the forest. Not only density, but how many trees there are. And of course, that affects wind. If we're going thin it, now the wind's going to penetrate in there a lot more. That's going to have an effect on the moisture. It's going to have an effect on the way heat gets pushed around in there. Likewise, if we regenerate it, that's going to change the profile. So all different structures and densities have different effects on wind. This is one of my horror slides. I had a professor once who referred to this as a silvicultural slum. They thinned a little too heavy in here for what the trees could stand, and I don't know how much of this was thinned to waste versus how much of it actually came down to blow down. But the good effective wind slide. Actually, I don't think it had to be very windy for these to fall down because they're all kind of like wet noodles anyway. Okay, water. Like I mentioned earlier, water is really one of our main limiting factors, especially on the lower end of our tree line. On the upper, it's probably more temperature. But it's used by plants in really large amounts. They're water pumps, pulling it out of the soil, putting it in the air. They compete for it fairly intensely. Most people kind of think about the above ground parts of trees. The crowns are kind of tight, but a lot of times, especially out here in the interior west, it's all the competition is going on underground. So there's pretty intense competition. Then we'll talk about soil transporting minerals in that. But the soil is our reserve. The air tends to pull the moisture away. And again, we have really good examples. This is, I think, very northern Colorado, southern Wyoming, as you're kind of coming across the Front Range there. Pretty abrupt transition to where you flop over from too dry for trees to just wet enough for trees. And that little effect I showed you in that kind of schematic diagram, here's whatever PJ or whatever it is in the very foothills here extending way down below the elevation it should be because it's nice and sheltered in a drain. So you can see a lot of these things operating, more of a southerly slope here, so you don't have any vegetation at all because the heat load's higher. So when you think of a tree, again, you kind of have to visualize this a little bit of what's going on underground, but the pool is kind of proportional to what the size or really what the leaf area of the tree is like. And there's different things about the characteristics. Needle-leaf trees tend to be more conservative about water than broadleaf trees and things like that. But essentially they're pumping out. So big trees are going to be pumping out from a lot bigger area than the small trees. And I have a pretty good slide to show you a little bit later on in some of the silviculture shots for that. So this is a stand that's essentially at full competition. There's a gap between the crowns, but not really a gap between the effective area of the roots. That's where it's going on there. That's where the competition. So thin enough for something else to grow in that stand, we have to leave some sort of gap there. Now it's not a huge gap, but if we want to regenerate, we can fit some younger trees in there. Okay, light. Another obvious one, except for Sedalpin fir, which can basically grow in the dark. Trees need light. Used in photosynthesis. Depending on the species that you have, and we'll revisit this again later, it can tolerate shade or it can really be light demanding, depending on the species. Light is really a fairly constant thing until you get to the top of the atmosphere, and that kind of brings in, I don't know if you saw in the paper recently, there's one guy that kind of running against the grain of the climate change wisdom right now, that he did an analysis of these satellite photos over the past, I think, 25 years. It's AVHR. It's the one they used to use all the time for weather before you did a lot of radar stuff. And he found that the clearness, what do you call it, like the optical air thickness of the atmosphere has been declining for the past 15 years or so after the last big volcanic eruption has been going down. And you can almost exactly correlate that with these extreme temperatures that we've been seeing. So they don't really want to hear that because it's all, CO2. But
So you mean like Pinatubo?
yeah. He's got a couple of big spikes at Pinatubo, and then there was one quite a bit before that when the first satellite first got up. And then so it's kind of level, and big spike of the effective thickness being high, and then recently there's this long trail off, and it's still going down. So he attributes a lot of the heating that could be accounted for just to that. So it's constant to the atmosphere, but then it really gets changed as it goes through, moisture and all that sort of thing. I'll have another story on that too. But really what counts for us is that it's absorbed by leaves. Trees, turn that energy into wood, which we all love. So shade, this little tree here, and unless we really know what species it is, we really don't know if this guy's happier or this guy's happier. They've got growing space out there, but they may or may not need the shade. Now what happens when the light comes in, what's not used in the photosynthesis is going to be changed in its frequency. Instead of, trees don't really reflect a whole lot of light. If you do a lot of photography and you look at a stand and you're like right in the stand, and you look at your light meter, I mean it's way down there. You have to really drop the shutter speed down and all that because they really do absorb a lot of light. But what does get absorbed, it tends to get re-radiated back. And we all do this. We all absorb light. We all radiate it back. But it changes the characteristics of everything that's around. It evaporates more water. It heats the ground up. Things like that. It can be a problem. Now plants, I guess if you wanted to relate to animals, are essentially equivalent of a cold-blooded thing. They metabolize based on their temperature. But the heat can get so high in some conditions that will actually damage the plant. We get heat girdling and spruce seedlings and that just because the soil gets so hot down around the roots that it actually hurts them. And there's a lot of names for what goes on here. You have light coming in. Some of it reflects. Some of it, of course, gets absorbed as heat. Some of it conducts into something that it's touching down into the ground, or radiates out into the air, radiates into its neighbors. All this lower frequency stuff, lower wavelength stuff goes out, or the air just carries it away in convection. And we got a lot of that sort of thing going on in the forest. A lot of it gets absorbed there. Of course, if you open up the stand, a lot of it's going to hit the ground, where depending on what the understory is like, it may or may not have a lot of photosynthesis going on. And if there's not things absorbing it and turning it into tissue, then it's going to tend to heat up more and more. Or it may be reached down into little guys that really need it. Now that ground heating, if you have some shade, is going to be, of course, much less than if you've got a lot of light coming in and that gradient, that the amount of heat coming off the ground is going to be much more intense. And we all know this from walking around the woods. But these are all the sort of things that we're manipulating. Now, this is the other side story. And if you guys ran across this in the newspaper, you may or may not decide to read that article. It's kind of a plain science-sounding article in there. But I guarantee you that at least some of you in the room have heard a newspaper story about this. And what the headline says was, trees cause global warming.
Yes.
Any of you guys see that?
Yes.
Okay. This is it. Now there was an experiment called. Now the experiment took place in a computer. And what he says here is latitude-specific deforestation experiments, this is a model, indicate that afforestation projects in the tropics would be clearly beneficial and mitigate global scale warming, but would be counterproductive if implemented at high latitudes that would only offer marginal benefits in temperate regions. That's us. So anywhere from here north, trees are bad for climate change. Any takers? Well, this is what they did. And these little things I'm talking about, all this micro scale stuff, he did it at the global scale with the computer model. They said, well, yeah, you have a little bit more warming, but it makes more clouds, and then the clouds reflect it back into the atmosphere, up into space, and he took it all into balance, and the balance came out as more heating, and that's why he did the thing. Of course, all the people who watch these articles come out in the proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences jumped all over it and gave us those headlines. Okay, so this is what that guy's doing. Okay, light comes in, tree radiates out in all sorts of different directions down to the ground, which we know. We just covered that. Okay, but if you have snow, some of that radiation is going to melt the snow, then heat the ground. The heat goes into the air, and we have global warming. Okay. Now, if you don't have trees, what they're saying is, well, it's all about the albedo, which is the reflectivity of the surface of the snow. And yeah, a little bit goes up, a little bit goes down, but most of it just goes beaming back off into space. So the conclusion is that no trees, cooler ground, or at least cooler air around the ground. Well, a couple of years ago, I was down in northern New Mexico, right about this time of year. And I was up on this overlook, and I thought, man, that's a cool looking picture. And I looked down there, and this is probably about 4 in the afternoon, something like that. So you can see the shadows out here are just kind of coming to the, pointing off to the northeast. So if you back the clock up a little bit, you'll notice that all of those little packs of snow are kind of facing north. And I'm like, well, if this guy's telling the truth, then the snow should be over here where there aren't any trees, right? And I thought, well, here's a place where there's no trees, but there's snow, but there's a little hole there, a little topographic shading. There's a lot of snow up there where there's a lot of trees and a lot of shading. So I don't know. Our report, you decide. Okay, scaling up into soil. It's a little more interesting because we're trying to integrate a few different things now. Of course, it's got inert and living components. And the living components being the little microorganisms for the most part, worms, all that good stuff. Of course, it provides physical support, and it's the reservoir for all these other things that are going on. Top of the soil is what we're really interested in, and we'll talk about that a little bit more later on. Now, the surface is where a lot of, as a transition zone, really where a lot of stuff happens. Percolation of water and air getting into the soil and providing oxygen to the roots, things like that. Soils tend to take a long time to develop. Some are less developed and are more developed than others. Out here in Utah, we have some very, very, very old soils, especially in the really dry lands. Are pretty interesting. But the texture, the structure, the parent material this stuff came from all has an effect on the characteristics of the soil. Now, I could show this better. I haven't figured out a good way to do it because it looks like all of the air and the water up in the top of the tree and the minerals are in the bottom. That's not true. The graph is meant to show that it's mostly carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and there's a little bit of all this other stuff in there, kind of like us. We're mostly water. And I'm using this soil profile here, probably not what you'd consider a typical forest soil, but it does have all of the elements in here that let us talk about these various parts. Soil nutrients tend to be most closely associated with the organic matter that's in the soil. And in this nice little, probably an alpha sol, we've got a little bit of an organic layer up there. Then it grades down here. This E horizon is actually a place where organic matter and even a lot of the finer materials leached out, so it has less of that than anything else. And then it kind of accumulates back in here, depending on what the climate is and how deep that goes. This is about 3.5 feet deep there. But most of the nutrients are all bunched up at the surface, like I said, and then you have that little deficit zone kind of in the middle there. For water, the profile is a little different. And then we're going to contrast closed stands and open stands and lead me into our kind of silvicultural manipulations. If it's closed stand, a lot of trees, a lot of pumping going on. So down at depth, there actually tends to be not much water. Also up high, there's a lot of stuff taking up water close to the surface. In a more open stand, the equation changes a little bit. It's actually even more reduced at the surface because you have that direct penetration of the sunlight and radiation, evaporating it off, so that's a little lower. But just below that, where you don't have so much of that effect, you're still retaining quite a bit of the moisture you had before, and at depth, where there's not so many roots pumping out, now you have even more water down there. And we know that if you harvest an area that's kind of marginally wet, you're going to bring that water table up pretty quick. That's what's going on there. Soil temperature is a little more well-behaved thing. Basically, what you'll end up with, and this is a kind of a summertime temperature profile here. Highest temperature is at the surface and decreasing as you go down. Does anybody know what the lowest temperature you'll get as you go down here? What that magic number is? Well, it depends on where you live, because what it is it's the mean annual air temperature, long-term air temperature. And so what happens is at the surface you get this fluctuation from high temperature to low temperature to high temperature, and as you go farther and farther and farther down, it gets dampened and dampened until it doesn't really change anymore. So if you wanted to know that, you're moving to some place you don't know what the weather's like, it's not going to tell you anything about the high or the low, but it's going to tell you what the average is if you kind of dig down at 4 or 5 feet and do that. Up in Fairbanks, it was just above 0. Okay, so in an open stand, of course, just like we said, you're going to heat up those upper layers, but you're going to get that same dampening effect. It's really not going to affect it way down at depth. Okay, so that kind of leads us into decomposition and recycling into litter, because as trees grow, produce litter, that those nutrients have got to be recycled so they can be taken up again. It's generally a limited pool, although you'll see on one side it's a pretty good-sized pool. Get some inputs from the atmosphere. There's always nitrogen and sulfur and things like that raining down on the ground. Some organisms, cow goes, eats in the field, drops a few pies in the woods. Outputs from leaching, erosion. We don't really have a lot of leaching going on around here because we have kind of moderate precip, and in some places it can be pretty substantial. Also has to do with the types of forest and the successional stage of the forests, whether they're leafy or tight. And then, of course, the microorganisms we're talking about here have a lot to do with it. This just contrasts a couple of different forest types with the nitrogen. Big pools in the soil right here. You can see the leaching. This is a pretty poor site, so the vegetation's really holding on to everything. It's getting rotated pretty quick through there. Southeast coastal plain, you get a little bit of leakiness, kind of coarse sandy soils. It gets out. But those, you go to ecosystem, the size of those pools will vary quite a bit. You notice, well, what's in the vegetation is just a fraction of what's down in the soil. When you get that into harvesting and what effect that has on the nutrient pool, it really depends on a lot of things. If you have a long rotation, you're going to pull some nutrients out with the tree, no matter what you do. Some's in the wood, a lot of it in the foliage. And if your rotation is long enough so that it fully recovers, you're never really going to drive that nutrient pool down, so there's a problem. But if you're on a very short rotation, you're pulling off more than can replenish in the amount of time in your rotation, you'll eventually drive it down. Same thing if you're taking whole stems with foliage and everything versus just the bowl. There's really not a high concentration in the bowl, so that'll have an effect. And last, if there's a rate of either natural replenishment or you ameliorate somehow with fertilization, the rate of the nutrient replenishment can allow you to be a little more flexible. This is one of these slides that last time I dug this out was 5 years ago for one of Darren's workshops. And I think I must have borrowed this from him. I looked at that and I thought, what the heck is that little yellow thing there? And I realized, this is decomposition. That's one of the little microbes. It was one of those things that kind of delayed reaction. The size of the microbe in this next couple series of slides means the kind of rate, the speed of the recycling. So for kind of a cool and dry climate, you have some level of action there. And as you either make things moister or make things warmer, you'll tend to increase that rate of recycling, increase that microbial action. Now, if you go too far beyond that, you'll pass some threshold where the microbes just really aren't happy. And I should say that actually, if you go in this direction too, much drier, much cooler, they're not going to be happy either, and everything will kind of shut down. High Arctic, there's not a lot going on with it. But if you kind of maintain that balance of moisture and heat, you could really ramp things up. So here we're kind of talking about the tropics. Here we're talking about maybe more temperate zones. Here, boreal forest, or even some of the higher elevations in our neighborhood here, in terms of rate of recycling. You see that because wood just stays around a long time in some of ours, and some of it just because it's kind of going up this warm and dry scale. That, in the southeast, you throw a baseball bat in the woods, it'll probably be gone in 3 years. If you throw it up here on the top of the Uintas, it'd be here for 200 or something like that. Some pretty low rates. So we'll kind of revisit our little soil profile here and talk about the microbes now, except contrast in a dense stand and in a more open stand. And this is kind of integrating the moisture and the heat and all those little profiles I showed you before. So let's take in a closed stand at the soil surface, you've got pretty good decomposition going on. In a more open stand at the very surface, that's going to kind of decrease a bit because it's going to be a little bit drier. If you're going around the stand just been thin, you're kicking around that top litter, it's pretty dry. It's just not much going on with that. It's more just kind of drying up on it. However, if you go down another layer where the moisture is much better, you don't have to dig too deep around here. It can be a dust bowl on top, and you get down an inch, and it's kind of moist. there's actually kind of a compensating effect in the more open stand. So if you're taking the aggregate of the first, foot or so, it's probably about a wash. And in fact, as you go down in the soil, the more open stand, if you kind of sum it all up, because of a little bit of more warmth and more abundant moisture, because of less root competition, you'll actually get that decomposition. And we count on that because we want those nutrients to be freed up for the little guys coming in when we do our regeneration. Just a short thing on compaction. I kind of alluded to it earlier. When we're doing operations out there, that interface between the air and the soil is important. And because there's pores in there, the worms are always making in more pores for us. Frost activity, a lot of things, roots, all that sort of thing. But then stomping on it or rolling tires over it, skidding things on it tends to compact a little bit. So that's really what we're trying to avoid. We're trying to avoid, decreasing that air and water capacity and hence the microbial activity in there. Same thing with the roots. If you look at kind of a generalized schematic root here, in the plan view, it looks kind of like you'd expect, kind of like a tree in reverse there. These little lines on the end are just where they stop mapping it. But if you look down here in the elevation view, you see two different things going on completely. You got these guys down here, which are going for what? Water. You got these guys all concentrated up there that are going for air, nutrients. That's where all the action's going on in the upper. So you can see if you're going to be compacting the soil, yeah, sure, the tree will still have a lot of water, but something's going to go on with those nutrients. Turns out these roots up here are really active. This might be around for a few years, and it's going to mine out that area in terms of the nutrients. Again, kind of depending on what ecosystem you're in. In the tropics, they're probably everywhere all the time. But then those will die back, and those will move somewhere else to mine some other area out. And it's at a cost to the tree too, because it's got to redo those roots. So really, and when we're talking about soil and managing the quality of the soil, we really want to protect as much of the integrity of the topsoil as possible. Minimize the area. That's why we concentrate skid trails and things like that. Redistribute the litter. I'll have kind of a nice slide on that in a little bit. Because we want those nutrients. We don't want the slash pile to be the only place where those nutrients are. Depending on where you're at. Now, as I said, bad idea, but it really depends on where you're at. Because if the pool is very, very abundant and you do pile a little bit of slash, yeah, you're going to make a higher concentration there, but you really might not have depleted it to any really consequential level elsewhere. You saw how big those pools were in the soil relative to what was in the tree. So almost every answer in ecology is it depends. So that's I got to take home message. And so it really depends. It depends a lot where you're at. Yeah, I don't have any really good pictures of it, but I've seen it in the field where there's a huge slash effect. I mean, just where it was windrowed and burned and stuff. And boreal forest, up in interior Alaska, where it's fairly low precipitation, 10, 11 inches a year, cold soils, that sort of thing. You'd see down to no regeneration at all, and then the seedlings are going like this. With the old windrows. So it just didn't, because of not much moisture, it doesn't really distribute itself well in the soil. So it really depends. Depends. This is a good example. It's about 10, 12 years ago. We were up in Maine on a field trip. It was a balsam fir. And the night before, it had rained so much, it was kind of like that nor'easter that just came through there, that we thought we were going to get stranded out there because it was taking out hardtop roads. Culverts were going out, all sorts of stuff. And then we were going to go to this thinning operation out here in balsam fir. And that's kind of typical. What they were doing is operating up and down these skid trails. We're using a processor type pickle length deal. And the equipment wasn't out there when we were on this particular site. But they would reach as far as they could in and pluck that stuff out and then spread it around. The nice thing is as they did that, they left a nice bed as they went along. And with all of that rain, with roads blowing out, with all that sort of stuff, these little puddles here, which were really flowing, and it's growing throughout the litter, were clear enough to drink out of. I mean, it was a really nice job. So maintaining the soil. So now we're integrating all this stuff together. We'll get to competition a little bit here. Of course, we all know that there are fewer trees, they grow faster. This is actually, I think, off an actual levels of growing stock study. Of course, I think most of us would rather the 8-inch tree than the 4-inch tree in those cases. But there's trade-offs. You can maximize individual tree growth, or you can maximize the stand growth altogether, but you can't do both simultaneously. And we look at this kind of on a graph where our y-axis here is the volume increment, and the x-axis is how much growing stock we have out there. Of course, you have 2 trees to the acre. They can be growing as fast as they want. You're not putting on much volume to the acre. Add more trees. You get up to kind of a saturation point where now they're butting up against each other, and you kind of plateau out. It's interesting. Jim Long and I just started doing some work on taking inventory data from my program, where we do increments on all of the cores we do. So we have tens of thousands of plots now that people haven't really mined that data for good growth and yield data and good growth and yield information. And we've got he's put together a really nice model for ponderosa pine so far. It's really neat. And actually the curve looks more like that. And we don't see any upper end to it. Up to the maximum allowable stand densities, it just seems to be going up. And and basically you can take the stand density, using the stand density index, and the site index, you can explain about 90% of the yield of that stand. It'll be pretty neat models. We did it kind of on like just Arizona, and then we just expanded it to the whole West, and it looks like it's going to be pretty nice. Now, of course, the trees, once they're all alone out there and not bumping up against their neighbors, they're going to be at whatever their maximum possible growth rate is, given the environment, their moisture, their heat, and all that sort of thing. But then as they go down, we're going to trade off eventually where they're not very happy anymore. Other than the growth effects, there are other consequences to stand density. Talking about fire, which is one of them, is that in general, the more dense the stand gets, you've got those ladder fuels, and that's it's going to be a risk there. So we're talking about density, and can make a difference whether you have a nice control underburn or you have a stand replacing conflagration. One of the other consequences has to do with insects and disease, and something we're dealing with. The ponderosa pine is a good example, mountain pine beetle and all that. In general, this story is true. You get much more density. The chance for having bugs in there goes way up because they're less vigorous and less able to fight it off. What's interesting, there was some work done some years back on lodgepole pine that suggests that the relationships is more like this. Because what happens is the lodgepole, and it's really the only species I think that is capable to do that, can get in such awful dog hair nasty stands at those high densities that the phloem is not thick enough for the beetles to make a living in, so they can't do very well in there. So they tend to be more in the middle and stuff. And I've talked to the entomologist that came out with that paper. Well, Jim was on that, Long was on that too, and they said they still think that holds up. So kind of interesting there, but certainly with something like spruce beetle, the dense spruce. Okay, so getting to the kind of punchline here, silvicultural systems. If we're talking about them in general, they're a conceptual model of stand development. So we are going to either mimic something roughly that we know species or forest type can go through, or we're going to invent a new one for our needs. But it takes into account species characteristics, stand structure of that. It's really kind of a strategic plan. You want to, you're really, and when you talk about a silvicultural system, you're not talking about an individual treatment. You're talking about a potential series of treatments and an outcome over time. This is the only equation I'm going to show you. And it's a word equation. It's a reproduction method plus intermediate treatments. Okay? That's the system. And so what you have is, for whatever system you're talking about, is these series of, and I say anticipated interventions because some of them may or may not come to pass depending on what happens. You may have to do more work than you thought you did, a regeneration failure or something like that. But the name of the system is named for the thing. Remember, we're going way back to slide 1, whether you make your babies or not. And so it's named for the thing that causes the regeneration in there. Thinning. Is that a silvicultural system? No. It's an intermediate treatment. Would it make babies? Maybe, maybe not. Fertilization, obviously, intermediate treatment. When we do these things, we're talking about, going back to square one, manipulate the environment. We either manage for an open environment in case we're looking for, or we'll have as a consequence, environmental extremes, the temperature, the moisture, that sort of thing. You don't want competition going on there because you're dealing with species that don't like competition. So the ones that basically fall into that category are the clear-cut system and seed tree methods. It might be a very large group selection. Again, the size of the group that you take, they amount to being little mini clear-cuts. So depending on the species, there's a certain on edge effect, but you have to have a certain size for species with varying based on their tolerance. In a more sheltered environment, you're saying, well, we don't want things to fluctuate that much. We want to release some nutrients, get some more light in there, release some moisture, but we don't want it to be that radical. Okay, so you reduce the radiation, you reduce the temperature extremes, you kind of keep the moisture on a little more even keel, but you're left with competition, root competition, shade, things like that. The most extreme or the most sheltered would be if you're just doing a single tree selection, you're kind of in there plucking around. If a little less extreme than that is kind of a heavier shelter wood, where you're leaving a lot of overstory. Okay, and then you can kind of relate that to structure as well. If you want to maintain an even age structure, and even age can really mean two ages in there. So clear cutting is your most open seed tree, shelter wood. Seed tree is just you're leaving even less. You're doing a shelter wood from an open to shelter gradient. Uneven age structure. The group tends to be less sheltered than just doing single trees or very, very small groups. Now, this is in silviculture planning. How much you leave in the overstory is a big deal because depending on what species you have, what species you want versus the ones you don't want is going to really dictate how much of that overstory you leave. So what you have to determine is, okay, what's the minimum shelter that's necessary for establishment? If you have no shelter and you want to get spruce, you're going to have problems. Whereas aspen might not have to be that big a deal. And what's the maximum shelter that's acceptable? If you're talking about intolerant species, it's just not going to go unless you cross that threshold to where it has open space in there. So clear cuts, I think we've all seen one or two. Site prep. If you do a burn prep, what do you think that does for the surface temperatures? Put your little seedling in there, jack that sucker up with that black surface. It's going to put a lot of heat at the surface. So you better be planting something in there that's tolerant of that, or that's seeding in there that's tolerant of that. My extreme site prep slide. This is up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Really high groundwater. If Mike stepped in that hole, the peak of that thing would be about here. In fact, one of the guys on the field trip did that, and it's actually quicksand at the bottom because it's down the water table. But you think about it, it looks ridiculous, and after it's there for 10 or 20 years, it kind of mellows out a little bit. It's still not fun to walk through. But if you're going to come in here and plant, which they do, you have a choice of just about any planting site imaginable, from Sahara Desert to, Okefenokee Swamp down at the bottom there, and then all your aspects and stuff to it. But it's sand, it's just sand, pure dead sand. They just fuck it, Strangest thing you've ever seen. Okay, Shelterwood Method can have up to 3 steps: the prep, the establishment, and removal. We'll show you a little graphic on those. Depending on what's going on in your stand history, you may not have to do all 3. In a 2-step, you might have an already managed stand, so you really don't have to prepare it. It's already kind of ready to go. So you're just going to do the regeneration step. If everything's going your way, you can really do a 1-step Shelterwood and really just do the removal, because the regeneration there has gotten it there on its own. And it could be a more intolerant species sneaking up, or a more tolerant species sneaking in under an intolerant species, so you're just going to remove that overstory and let that other species go. And then you do reserves. It's kind of a variation on the theme, where instead of doing the final removal, you're leaving some there. Now, again, there's consequences to that, because your available growing space, and this goes back to our growth-growing stock relationships, shelter, all that stuff, you're paying a tax on having those older trees there. Not to mention the fact they could fall down. That may be a good idea. That may be part of your prescription to have some big old dead wood on there. So kind of the range of densities in shelter woods. This is kind of the classic method here. We have some that's got some undesirable characters in there. Prep it up real nice. You haven't cut it back to whatever that level is for what you're trying to regenerate. You cut it back to get the growth on those trees for a while, but not back far enough so that you release that extra growing space into making babies. Then you do the next cut that does release that growing space, supplying the seed for that, and then if you so desire, you come back and take the older wood off, and you're done for a while. That can also be done. Now that's kind of like in an area. It's done uniformly. I don't know that we do too much of this. I've never really seen it out there. Europeans are kind of big on this in some places, but the marching shelterwood sort of thing. You use a strip method, and it's the same sort of thing, except your steps kind of actually go in a line across the landscape. Now selection, kind of hard to show a picture of it because we're actually picking out little groups in there. But the trick with the selection is that we're coming up with some desired stand structure. It's going to be fairly uneven aged, irregular structure, a lot of little ones, very few big ones. We usually set an upper diameter limit, and then examine the stand every 10, 20 years, whatever it might be, to go in there and pull off whatever is in there that exceeds what our desired diameter distribution is. Again, when you get into very large group selection, you're really creating this mosaic of little tiny clear cuts. And so rather than being a kind of intimate mixture of age classes, which we can get here in spruce fir, where there's, you just walk on an acre, you can find almost any age imaginable. In a managed selection system, really with smaller or large groups, you're looking at this little mosaic with all these little patches out there. And we could work on that with ponderosa, some of the spruce fir stuff. Really hard to tell that it's even managed, but what you want is in your little opening, you have a nice little patch of regen there. They're all about the same age. So to wrap it up, on the list of Utah species, just the generalities of what they want or what they need, what they don't want. Our classic intolerance, aspen and lodgepole. Like I said before, you can tell lodgepole is intolerant of itself. It's the most sterile understory you're ever going to see in a dog hair. Awful lodgepole. Not much going on in the understory there. This is kind of the way we do it operational. This is just off of the school experimental forest. This is about a 140-year-old-ish stand. Really nice looking stuff up there. There's a kind of another part you get to invoke your radiation again, is if you have serotinous lodgepole, one of the things you need to do is open that up so that the heat can get down there and open those cones up so you can get your regeneration. I'm actually missing that guy because he was in the shade. Nice competition slide. You can tell about where the roots end. That's the edge of that clear cut. Man, step 2 feet in there, nothing. So our principles are at work. On a bigger scale, it's down to Uintas. Of course, we put nice wavy edges on there so they blend into the landscape. Jim and I were talking about the talk he's going to do this fall. I said, well, we're talking about up on the school forest. There's some good examples in there. And of course, back in I don't know when these were done, late 80s maybe. No, these were done later. These were done in 2000 or so, but you could see them. And when I did the Google Earth thing, I took it off for so I get a bigger picture here. But it puts the altitude on there, and I think the altitude that I'm looking at was just about what the shuttle flies at. So pretty easy to pick out. What's not so obvious though is this guy right here, which is a cut that Jim put in a few years ago. We'll zoom in on that puppy. And what he did was he applied several of the silvicultural systems to one stand and actually sucked in. There used to be a couple of these little patches going down through here and did a variety of treatments. So what they actually did is they pretended like a fire went through there, ran a simulation that would have started like down here in the lower end of the valley. So this lower part, this is actually uniform shelterwood down here. This is like a group shelterwood. There's I think there are maybe an acre or so max patches that they provide shade, they provide seed, and of course you can't see them at this scale, but he left a lot of individual trees scattered around that stand. So what do we got, like 250 acres here, I think it was? Eventually it was supposed to go up here. I'm not sure if they're going to end up doing that. You also see the aspen that got released to the world here just took off. There was not much aspen in that stand before, and I'll show you another slide like that. But even for space, that thing doesn't really blend in that much if I didn't show it to you. You can't tell so much from the surrounding, but we're in kind of the 20 to 40 acre patch mode, so that's what we get. Aspen, more tolerant things grow under it, but not too many baby aspen under there. You can have a stand that's really kind of choked up in the tolerance coming in there. If you slick that baby off, you're going to get lots of aspen. The other ones can't stand. The spruce aren't going to do very well out in there. Even the lodgepole are going to have a tough time racing against the aspen as they move up so quick. Okay, some shelter, ponderosa, Doug fir, white fir. I already showed you a couple of those, but that's kind of, there's the little shade of the crown over here, nice little patch of regen under there. We can kind of finesse that any way we want. And then our classic tolerance, Sedalpin fir being about as tolerant a tree as you can get. I mean, you look at it crossways and it gets a disease and falls over, but, right, good? But it grows in the dark and it's always there, and it's, you know, it's interesting. You talk about aspen because people love aspen, right? If I look in our database, I did this one time because I was kind of investigating this because we had the drought, you know, we had the big pinyon juniper die off down south and all that. So I was looking in our database, like, well, you know, what's dying, what's not dying. The number one tree in terms of percentage of dead stems tallied, or recent mortality stems, because when our crews get there, they say, okay, that's a dead old snag. This died in the last 5 years or so. You know, we make that distinction. The number one mortality tree in the whole interior west is Sedalpin fir.
How come we're not having a huge meetings?
Because we don't care. Because there's always 20 more behind the one that fell down. You can't keep it from going. Like Jim Long says, God loves Sedalpin fir. You know, doesn't want it to live very long, but he likes it to regenerate. So, yeah, so kind of classic. And there, you know, there's fir growing under aspen. I mean, that aspen stand is at whatever the max density was. I mean, it's a fully stocked stand, and you know, not going to stop me. So you've got everything from these little tiny guys up to actually some that have penetrated the overstory there. So when we want to grow more of that, it obviously can live in the shelter. You know, if we didn't put the slide in here with the stumps in it, you'd never know that anything was cut out of that because there's still an extreme amount of shelter, and you need it. You need it. We've got there's one up on the Daniel Forest spruce that was cut 30 years ago, something like that. Hard to believe I've been here over 10 already. And it was an old clear cut then. It's not regenerated yet. It's spruce clear cut. You know, nobody ever put the shade in there, and you know, it's got to go to aspen, I guess, eventually, and then come back to that.